Richard Turner was sitting in his office, looking through the monthly income statements. His employees were all well aware that they shouldn't disturb their boss at such moments and tried to keep the office as quiet as possible. Richard had one more page to go over when someone knocked softly on his door. "Come in," the businessman said and went back to reading. The door opened and his assistant, Veronica, came into his office. "Mr. Turner, excuse me, sir. The thing is, your granddaughter got into a bit of a situation," the woman started saying timidly. "What? Is Emily all right? Was she with the nanny? What happened?" the elderly businessman exclaimed, getting alarmed immediately. Veronica realized that she'd made an unfortunate mistake and immediately tried to rectify it. "Oh, no, she's fine. It's just that she almost got hit by a car. But everything worked out and Emily is okay. She's with the nanny," the assistant hurried to explain. Richard's forehead immediately got covered with sweat. Since the businessman couldn't concentrate on work after the news he got, he closed his office, called his driver, and headed home to see his granddaughter. Due to his extensive workload, Richard's brain was used to working even when the man was supposedly taking a rest, pulling him into the sad memories of his past. A year ago, a terrible tragedy befell the businessman's family. His only son, Kevin, died in a car accident. The man was on his way to a business meeting when he missed a turn in his Chevrolet and drove off the road. Kevin's car caught fire on impact, and by the time the rescuers arrived at the scene, it had already burned down to the ground. There was virtually nothing and no one left to identify. The fact that it was Richard Turner's son who was driving the car could only be determined by the metal buttons from his coat and his belt buckle. Losing his son came as an extremely painful blow for the businessman, who devoted himself to raising his only heir. Kevin was the meaning of life for Richard Turner, who made a fortune in the business of extraction and processing of oil. The businessman worked tirelessly to achieve everything he had, never getting any help from anyone. Richard was the perfect example of a person who had a dream and believed in himself enough to follow through on it. By the time the first oil field was developed, all that money that the future millionaire had in his pocket was $100, so he knew there was no going back for him. Richard understood that failure wasn't an option. He had to succeed. Now the businessman worked with millions and had thousands of employees under his command. But back then, he was an unremarkable thin man in glasses. But his eyes were burning with excitement and great ambitions. Richard had to go through a lot before he achieved success. Unfortunately, despite all the money he earned, the businessman's personal life wasn't great. There was no mutual understanding or support in Richard's marriage. Richard and his wife were simply too different, and it was unclear why they even ended up together. The only thing that Richard was always grateful to Amanda for was his son, Kevin. But a year ago, at the behest of evil fate, the businessman lost the most important person in his life. Lost in his memories, Richard didn't even notice when he dozed off. Lulled by the sound of the car's engine, the businessman involuntarily replayed in his mind the most significant episodes of his life. Richard fondly recalled the time when Kevin got tired of the endless attempts to have a baby and adopted a 4-year-old girl. Little Emily immediately became the family's favorite, so everyone in the family rushed to spoil her with gifts. Few people knew that it was actually Kevin who wanted to have a child, unlike his wife, Linda, who only cared about herself and her own comfort. Kevin met her quite by accident, and their relationship was most likely an attempt to forget his past and his beloved ex-girlfriend, Natalie Simpson. Despite the fact that Natalie was an orphan and worked in the city library, her worldview and attitude towards others were worthy of the highest praise. Kevin never felt as good with anyone as he did with Natalie. If it weren't for the painful breakup, they would have certainly started a wonderful family one day. Being always busy with work, Richard didn't really know the true reason for their breakup, but he suspected that it didn't happen without his wife's intervention. Kevin never said anything about it, and Natalie, who had always been rather timid, withdrew herself completely and never once showed her face in the millionaire's house after the breakup. It was then that Linda appeared in Kevin's life. She was like a snake who crawled into his life and wrapped herself around his neck, using her venom to dull Kevin's pain. The truth was that the devious young woman was only interested in Kevin's money, which she got access to immediately after the wedding. It took Kevin too long to realize what a mistake he'd made, and what happened afterwards was clear proof of that. Linda didn't like children, and therefore she didn't share her husband's desire to have them. It was for this very reason that Kevin decided to adopt little Emily. Unfortunately, Linda wasn't only unsupportive on his decision, but even left him a year later. The most surprising thing was that the young woman had the audacity to sue Kevin for a significant amount of money, which was an excellent reward for the scam she pulled off, having married the naive rich man. Fortunately, Kevin managed to pull himself together and didn't beat himself up over it, choosing to focus on raising his daughter instead. Unfortunately, the young man wasn't destined to live a long and happy life and died in a car accident a year later. Ever since then, Richard Turner was the only one taking care of Emily, who became the meaning of his entire life. Since the businessman couldn't devote enough time to raising his granddaughter on his own, he hired a nanny who ended up virtually moving in with them. Awakened by the jerk of the car pulling to a halt in front of the house, Richard opened his eyes and saw Emily on the doorstep. Her nanny was standing next to her eyes lowered guiltily. Due to her advanced age, she couldn't always keep up with the energetic little girl. "I got distracted just for a minute, Mr. Turner. I turned around and saw that Emily was already on the road. Fortunately, there was a little boy nearby. He was the one who pulled your granddaughter off the road." The nanny babbled as soon as she saw the businessman. "Come on, Mrs. Stone, I get it. I'm human too. What was the name of that boy, and what was he doing there?" Richard asked. "Grandpa, he's a very good boy. His name is Bobby. He was selling books on the street, and he was also asking people for money." Emily rushed to answer. Richard looked at the nanny in surprise, which made the woman cringe under his tenacious gaze. The boy was selling books, old ones. I guess he really needs money, Mrs. Stone added quietly. "Bobby actually gave me one of the books for free, so I would stop crying," Emily exclaimed and showed her grandfather a book with a brown cover. Richard picked it up carefully and glanced at the cover. At that moment, he realized that something very intriguing was happening. The fact was that Richard had already seen this book before. Moreover, he was the one who bought it in one of the antique stores in London. The inscription was made by Richard's very own hand and only confirmed his suspicion. "Dear God, that's simply impossible. I bought this book for Natalie several years ago," the man whispered, turning pale. The nanny was surprised to see the businessman's face change and didn't know what to say. And only Emily continued to run around her grandfather, laughing merrily, eager to get her book back. Meanwhile, Richard kept looking at the inscription he'd made himself and couldn't believe his eyes. He gave this book to his son's girlfriend over 8 years ago. Natalie Simpson was very fond of reading, and the best gift for her was always a book. And how did that little boy get his hands on it? The question was literally driving Richard crazy. Having decided to talk to the boy, the man went to the place where the nanny and his daughter last saw him. Fortunately, Bobby didn't go anywhere and was still trying to sell his book to people on the street, as if nothing had happened. "Hello, I see you have a good selection here. Do you like reading?" the businessman asked, coming closer. The boy raised his eyes in surprise. He seemed a bit taken off by the old man's question, but he still answered. "Yes, I like reading, but they aren't my books." "Then whose are they?" Richard couldn't help but ask. "They're my mother's. She's very sick and needs money for surgery, so I'm helping her as much as I can. I sell books and all kinds of magazines, and when no one wants to buy anything, I just ask people for money, begging for money, basically," Bobby explained. The little boy's confession shocked Richard deeply. Still afraid of his own suspicions, the man gathered his courage and asked, "You know what? I will sell all these books and give you some extra money if you take me to your mother. What do you say?" Bobby looked doubtfully at the businessman, after which he answered, "I say let's do it. What is there to think about? But you're not going to trick me, are you?" Richard grinned, took several large denomination bills out of his pocket, and handed them over to the boy. Bobby's eyes shone with excitement. The little boy took Mr. Turner's hand to take him to see his mother. "Wait a moment, I'll just ask my driver to get the books," Richard exclaimed with a smile. Bobby led his companion through some alleys, which made the man feel like he was in some strange country he'd never been to before. Finally, the boy stopped by a little house with the chimney leaning to one side and peeling paint on the windows. "You don't seem to be doing too well," Richard said quietly. But the main surprise was waiting for him inside. Having followed Bobby inside the house, Richard came face to face with his chalk-white mother. Of course it was Natalie, who'd lost at least 15 pounds since the man last saw her. "Mr. Turner, what are you doing here?" the woman asked quietly. Natalie's appearance made it obvious that the woman was very sick and was barely managing to hold back her tears. "Bobby saved my granddaughter and gave her a book, the very book I bought for you in London," Richard explained. "Does Kevin have a daughter? I guess it didn't take him long to forget all about me. Well, I guess it's time for him to meet his son too," Natalie whispered with a sob. At first, Richard thought that Natalie was joking. But when he looked into her eyes, he realized that she was telling the truth. As it turned out a little later, Natalie was already pregnant with Kevin's baby at the time of their breakup. It's hard to say why she hid this fact from her boyfriend. She probably didn't want to be a burden, especially since the breakup was very painful for both of them. Having given birth to a beautiful baby, Natalie didn't grumble about her fate and decided to raise her son on her own. Everything was going relatively well until the woman got diagnosed with cancer. It happened a year ago, around the time Kevin died in a car accident. Of course, Natalie couldn't afford to get treatment or surgery, so she quickly began to wither away. Little Bobby couldn't watch his mother suffer and tried to earn money by selling old books, a beautiful but naive undertaking. Natalie's story stirred up an entire storm of feelings and emotions in Richard's heart. Having realized that Bobby was Kevin's son, the businessman decided to do everything possible to save the unfortunate woman. Of course, Richard had to use all of his connections for it, but Natalie's life and health were much more important to him than anything else. Having made arrangements for the woman to get her surgery, Mr. Turner took Bobby home with him so he could play with his half-sister whose life he'd recently saved. Meanwhile, Natalie was waiting for her surgery at one of the best medical centers specializing in this kind of disease. But before she went to the clinic, Natalie told Richard one very entertaining story. "Sir, please don't think that I'm crazy, but I've been having the same dream for several days now. Your son Kevin is alive and he lives in a house located in the very edge of the forest. There's a river nearby with a bridge over it. It was all so real that I even remember the name of the town," Natalie said, embarrassed by her own words. Richard frowned and then said, "Well, that's a very interesting dream indeed. I think I should check out this town just in case. And in the meantime, you need to get ready for your surgery. Please don't worry about anything else." At first, Richard Turner didn't think too much about Natalie's dreams. But when the oil tycoon opened the map and saw a town with such a name really existed, his surprise knew no bounds. Not only that, it was located only 3 miles away from the scene of the accident in which Kevin had allegedly died. Having decided to check everything out, Richard drove to this town in northwestern Wyoming the very next day. Imagine the businessman's surprise when everything there looked exactly how Natalie had described it. There was the bridge, the river, and even the house at the edge of the forest, which belonged to a retired ranger. But when Richard knocked on the door, he almost fainted when he saw who opened up for him. It was Kevin himself with the bushy beard and sad, gray eyes. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" the young man asked. Of course there is, son. It's me, your father," Richard exclaimed and hugged Kevin. At first, the young man couldn't understand what was happening, and only when the owner of the house told the guest about what had happened to his son, everything fell into place. About a year ago, an elderly ranger found the lifeless body of a young man in the forest. The stranger's head was broken, and he didn't remember anything about himself. The Lone Ranger nursed the young man back to health, but he never got his memory back. But when Richard showed his son some photos on his phone, a spark of insight flashed in his eyes. "Dad, Dad," Kevin exclaimed and rushed to hug his father. As it turned out later, a year ago, the young businessman got mugged. The robbers took Kevin's car, beat him up, and left him for dead. The muggers made one mistake though. They couldn't handle driving Kevin's car and crashed it just half an hour later. One of the robbers died on the spot and burned down with the car, while the other one managed to escape. Looking at the happy reunion of father and son, the retired ranger couldn't hold back his tears. It's hard to say how and why Natalie had that dream. Was it prophetic, or was it a subconscious message from Kevin, who'd lost his memory and track of time living out in the wilderness? Be that as it may, Natalie and Kevin finally got the happy ending they both deserved so much. Natalie's surgery in one of the best clinics in the country was successful, and she was now recovering rather quickly. Kevin returned to normal life, raising his 2 children, Emily and Bobby. Meanwhile, Richard Turner was glad that his son had finally found family happiness and was getting ready to marry Natalie, who was the love of his life and his closest person in the entire world.